What would you do if you had to choose between a $3 billion empire and the sound of your child's laughter? Tonight, I want to tell you about Richard Morrison, a man who had everything the world says should make you happy, yet went to bed every night feeling like he was slowly dying inside. A man who could buy anything except the one thing his heart was desperate for. A man who was about to discover that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what actually matters. But this isn't just another story about success and failure. This is about a single moment, one ordinary Tuesday afternoon, when a millionaire CEO watched a woman rock his crying son to sleep and realized he'd been living like a ghost in his own life. What happened next would cost him his career, his reputation, and every dollar he'd ever earned. But it would also save his soul. You see, sometimes the people who change our lives forever arrive disguised as exactly what we think we don't need. And sometimes the greatest success comes from having the courage to surrender everything you thought you wanted. If you've ever felt trapped by your own achievements, if you've ever wondered whether you're climbing the right mountain, if you've ever had to choose between what others expect of you and what your heart knows is true, then this story is for you. Stay with me for the next 2 hours, because by the end of this journey you might discover that the most important question isn't how do I get more, but what am I willing to give up to find what I actually need. Before we begin, if stories of courage, transformation, and the power of love resonate with your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories to people who need to hear them. And if this story touches you the way I hope it will, please share it with someone who might need a reminder that it's never too late to choose love over fear. Presence over profit, family over fortune. Now let me take you back to where it all began. It was 3 a.m. on a night when the rain drummed against the windows, like fingers tapping out a message from the universe, a message Richard Morrison was too busy to hear, too successful to need, too broken to understand. But that message was coming for him anyway, wrapped in the most unexpected package imaginable. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse like a relentless heartbeat. At 3 a.m., while the city slept beneath a blanket of amber lights, Richard Holden stood alone in his glass tower, a king in his kingdom of steel and silence. Success, they say, has a price. But no one tells you that sometimes the price is your own soul. In his hand, a crystal tumbler caught the city's glow, expensive whiskey that tasted like ash. Behind him, through an open doorway, lay a child's bedroom where a 4-year-old boy slept alone, his teddy bear fallen forgotten on the marble floor. Richard had built an empire worth $300 million. He commanded respect from boardrooms to headlines. He could buy anything, fix anything, control anything, except the one thing that mattered most. He couldn't bring himself to step across that threshold, couldn't face the innocent eyes that looked exactly like his late wife's, couldn't bear to see the hope that still flickered there, waiting for a father who had become a stranger in his own home. The penthouse around him was a monument to achievement, 43 floors, above the city, where silence cost more per square foot than most people earned in a year. Every surface gleamed with the cold perfection of a life lived for appearances rather than joy. The Italian marble floors reflected no warmth. The museum-quality art hung lifeless on walls that had never heard genuine laughter. And the kitchen stood pristine and unused, a testament to a man who'd forgotten that homes were meant to nourish souls, not just showcase success. He turned away from his son's room, unable to bear the weight of his own failure as a father. The living room stretched before him like an Arctic landscape. White leather furniture that had never been truly lived on, a fireplace that had never warmed a family gathering, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with business strategy guides, and industry publications, but devoid of bedtime stories or fairy tales. On his phone, 17 missed calls from Mrs. Chen, the elderly nanny who'd become more of a parent to Ethan than Richard had ever managed to be. Each unanswered call was another stone in the wall he'd built between himself and the life he was supposed to be living. Each silent ring was another moment of his son's childhood slipping away, while he pursued achievements that felt increasingly hollow with every passing day. The city below pulsed with the lives of 8 million people, most of whom would never know his name or care about his net worth, yet who probably understood better than he did what it meant to come home to love instead of returning to a mausoleum of their own making. Somewhere out there, fathers were reading bedtime stories, mothers were kissing scraped knees, families were creating the kind of memories that no amount of money could purchase and no corporate success could replicate. Richard took another sip of whiskey and felt it burn all the way down, a physical manifestation of the pain he'd been carrying since Sarah's death 2 years ago. He'd built this fortress of wealth and achievement, believing it would protect him from further loss, but all it had done was isolate him from the one person who needed him most, the little boy sleeping just 30 feet away, who still asked Mrs. Chen every night when Daddy would come home early enough to say goodnight. But success without soul is merely an expensive form of emptiness, and somewhere across the city, another empire was being built, one measured in kindness rather than capital. Morning arrived like a business transaction, precise, scheduled, emotionless. Richard descended from his penthouse office at exactly 6:47 a.m., his Italian suit pressed to perfection, his expression carved from the same marble that adorned his lobby. The 40-story Morrison Medical Technologies building bore his name in letters visible from space. Inside, a symphony of commerce played out. Phones ringing with million-dollar deals, keyboards clicking out reports that moved global markets, elevators humming as they carried his empire's heartbeat from floor to floor. "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," came the chorus of voices as he passed. Heads bowed, eyes averted, not from respect but from the ice that seemed to follow in his wake. In the boardroom, charts climbed skyward like his ambitions. "Quarterly profits up 23%, announced his CFO. "The Southeast. Asian expansion exceeded projections by 40 million. Richard nodded. Signed documents that would change lives he'd never meet, approved strategies that would reshape markets he'd never see. His phone buzzed insistently in his pocket. Mrs. Chen's name flashing on the screen. The nannies are calling about his son. He declined the call and slipped the phone back into his jacket. There were more important matters to attend to, but as he stared out at the city below, Richard couldn't shake the image that haunted his mornings. A little boy sitting at a breakfast table set for two, eating cereal alone, while cartoon characters provided the only laughter in an empty kitchen. The Morrison Technologies empire hummed with the efficiency of a machine that never slept, never questioned, never felt. 12,000 employees. Across 6 continents moved like clockwork, their lives dictated by the quarterly rhythms of growth targets and profit margins that Richard had orchestrated with surgical precision. On wall-mounted screens throughout the building, stock prices climbed steadily upward, each green number representing millions in shareholder value, thousands of jobs secured, hundreds of medical innovations that would save lives he'd never witness. Yet for all its magnificent scope, the empire felt increasingly hollow at its center. Richard's corner office on the 42nd floor was a shrine to achievement. Industry awards lined mahogany shelves, framed magazine covers proclaimed him Visionary of the Year and Healthcare's Most Innovative Leader, while signed photographs with presidents and Nobel laureates testified to his place among the world's most influential figures. The massive windows offered a god's-eye view of the city, where lesser mortals scurried through their insignificant lives far below. But the view that truly captured Richard's attention wasn't the sprawling metropolis or the distant horizon. It was the reflection in the glass, showing a man he barely recognized anymore. When had his eyes become so cold? When had his smile transformed from genuine warmth to a calculated tool for closing deals? When had he started measuring every human interaction in terms of strategic advantage rather than simple connection? His assistant's voice crackled through the intercom. "Mr. Morrison, your 9 a.m. with the Japanese delegation is here. They're particularly interested in the cardiac monitoring subsidiary." Richard straightened his tie, a habit that had become as automatic as breathing, and prepared to deliver another flawless performance in the theater of corporate supremacy. But as he reached for the door handle, his phone buzzed again. Mrs. Chen, persistent as always, refusing to be silenced by his professional priorities. This time, a text message accompanied the missed call. "Ethan had nightmares again. asked. "When Daddy is coming home, he drew you a picture." The words hit Richard like shrapnel, piercing through layers of executive armor to reach something soft and vulnerable that he'd buried beneath years of quarterly reports and board meetings. Somewhere in his penthouse, a 4-year-old boy was creating art for a father who existed more as concept than presence, more as financial provider than emotional anchor. But the Japanese delegation was waiting, along with $100 million deal that would cement Morrison Technologies' dominance in the Pacific Rim market. There would be time for pictures later. There was always going to be time later, in that mythical future when the next big deal was closed, when the company was finally secure enough to allow him the luxury of fatherhood. But every empire, no matter how mighty, has cracks where the light gets in, and sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected places. From teachers who've lost their jobs but never lost their hope, from hearts that refuse to harden despite being broken. Across the river in Brooklyn, Maya Thompson was packing the last of her dreams into cardboard boxes. The Roosevelt Elementary School classroom that had been her sanctuary for 6 years was now just 4 bare walls and the ghost of children's laughter. 28 desks had been stacked in the hallway. The reading corner, where she'd spent countless hours helping struggling students find their voice, was now marked with painter's tape for renovation. The window garden, where she'd taught her kids that even the smallest seeds could grow into something beautiful, had been cleared away. "You were the best teacher we ever had," Principal Martinez said, his voice heavy with regret as he watched Maya tape up her final box. "The children adored you. Then why?" Maya's voice caught in her throat. "Budget cuts, state funding, you know how it is." He couldn't meet her eyes. "I'm sorry, Maya, I truly am." That evening, in her modest apartment above a corner bakery, Maya sat across from her younger sister Jenny at a kitchen table that had seen better decades. The scent of tomorrow's bread drifted up from below, a comforting constant in a world that seemed determined to shift beneath their feet. "The tuition bill came," Jenny said quietly, sliding an envelope across. The scratched Formica surface. Due in 30 days, Maya studied her sister's face, young, hopeful, brilliant. Jenny was 3 semesters away from becoming the first person in their family to graduate college, 3 semesters away from breaking a cycle that had trapped the Thompson women for generations. "I'll figure it out," Maya said, the same words she'd spoken every month for the past 2 years. She looked around their small home, the refrigerator held together with duct tape, the space heater that only worked when positioned just right, the stack of unpaid bills held down by a coffee mug that read, "World's Greatest Teacher," a gift from a student whose parents couldn't afford much but who'd given their heart. Maya had always believed that love multiplied when divided, that giving pieces of yourself to help others grow only made you stronger. But sitting in that dim kitchen, listening to her sister's dreams bump against their reality, she wondered if there was anything left of herself to give. The classroom had been more than just her workplace. It had been her calling, her canvas, her contribution to a world that often forgot its most vulnerable citizens. For 6 years, she'd transformed that small space into a sanctuary where children who'd been written off by the system could discover that they mattered, that their voices deserved to be heard, that their potential was limitless regardless of their circumstances. She'd spent her own meager salary on supplies that the school budget couldn't cover, books for children who'd never owned one, art supplies for imaginations that hunger had tried to diminish, snacks for empty stomachs that made learning impossible. Her desk drawer had been a treasure trove of band-aids for scraped knees and broken hearts, tissues for tears that had nothing to do with skinned elbows, and small toys that served as rewards for breakthroughs that standardized tests would never measure. The memories flooded back as she sealed each box. Marcus, the boy with the stutter who'd found his voice through poetry. Lucia, whose parents spoke no English but whose daughter had become the bridge between 2 worlds. David, the foster child who'd cycled through 7 homes but had found stability in room 23, where Maya's consistency had taught him that not all adults would abandon him when things got difficult. Each child had left their mark on her heart, had taught her something about resilience, hope, and the transformative power of believing in someone when they couldn't yet believe in themselves. But the education budget didn't account for hard work, didn't measure the moments when a teacher becomes a lifeline, didn't quantify the irreplaceable value of someone who sees potential where others see problems. Now, as she sat in her small apartment listening to Jenny practice her presentation for tomorrow's economics class, Maya felt the weight of impossible choices. Her sister was so close to graduating with a degree in social work, so close to becoming the first Thompson woman to break free from the cycle of struggle that had defined their family for 3 generations. Their mother had worked 2 jobs, just to keep food on the table. Their grandmother had never learned to read. Their great-grandmother had scrubbed floors in buildings owned by people who would never know her name. But Jenny was different. Jenny was brilliant, determined, passionate about creating systemic change that would help families like theirs. She was 3 semesters away from a degree that would let her fight poverty from the inside, instead of just surviving it from the outside. 3 semesters away from becoming the social worker that Maya had wished they'd had when their father left, and their mother fell apart. The tuition bill felt like a mountain that Maya couldn't climb, a barrier that seemed designed to keep people like them in their place. But as she watched her sister rehearse her presentation about childhood development and trauma-informed care, Maya knew she'd find a way. She always did. She'd work 3 jobs if necessary, sell everything she owned, donate plasma twice a week, whatever it took to ensure that Jenny's dreams didn't die in a dim kitchen above a bakery. Miles away from Richard's glass fortress, in neighborhoods where dreams wore work clothes and hope survived on determination rather than trust funds, another story was quietly unfolding, one that would soon collide with the empire of steel and silence in ways neither soul could yet imagine. Fate, they say, has a sense of timing. Richard's office phone rang at exactly 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday that had started like every other Tuesday in his carefully orchestrated life. His assistant's voice carried an unusual urgency. "Mr. Morrison, there's a James Whitfield here to see you. He says it's about your son." James had been Richard's roommate at Harvard, his best man at his wedding, the godfather who'd held baby Ethan at his christening. He was also the one friend brave enough to speak truth to power. "You need help," James said without preamble, as he settled into the leather chair across from Richard's desk. He placed a manila folder on the polished surface between them. "And I found it—" Richard didn't look up from his computer screen. "I have help. Mrs. Chen has been with us for 2 years. Mrs. Chen is 73 years old, works 16-hour days, and last week I found her crying in your kitchen because Ethan asked her why his daddy doesn't like him." The typing stopped. Richard's hands hovered over the keyboard like a pianist who'd forgotten his piece. "This is Maya Thompson," James continued, opening the folder to reveal a photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a smile that seemed to carry sunlight. Former teacher, currently unemployed because she cared more about her students than politics. She has a background in child development, speaks 3 languages and— He paused, studying his friend's carefully composed mask. "She specializes in helping children who've experienced loss." The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither man wanted to cross. "She's different, Richard. She sees children the way Sarah used to see them." The mention of his late wife's name hit Richard like a physical blow. Sarah, who had sung lullabies in languages she didn't speak. Sarah, who had decorated the nursery with hand-painted murals of fairy tale castles. Sarah, who had died, bringing their son into the world, taking Richard's ability to love with her. "Set up the interview," Richard said quietly, closing the laptop with a sound like a prayer ending. "Fate, they say, has perfect timing. It waits for the moment when 2 broken souls are ready to discover that their separate wounds might heal better together, that their individual struggles might make sense only in the context of each other's pain, and that sometimes salvation arrives disguised as exactly what we think we don't need." The doorbell of the Morrison penthouse rang at exactly 4 p.m., its crystal chimes echoing through 43 floors of steel and glass like a prayer reaching toward heaven. Richard opened the 12-foot mahogany door to find Maya Thompson standing. In the marble hallway, her simple blue dress and nervous smile a stark contrast to the opulent fortress that had become his prison. "Mr. Morrison," Her voice carried the gentle authority of someone who'd spent years speaking to children, warm but certain, kind but uncompromising, with undertones of strength that suggested she'd weathered storms that would have broken lesser souls. "I'm Maya Thompson." Before Richard could respond, a sound erupted from somewhere deep in the apartment that made his blood freeze, the heartbroken wail of a child in absolute despair. Ethan was having one of his episodes, the kind that usually sent Mrs. Chen scrambling for tranquilizers and Richard fleeing to his study like a coward, abandoning a battlefield. The sound was pure anguish, the cry of a little boy who'd learned too young that the world was a place where mothers disappeared without warning, and fathers became ghosts in expensive suits. It was the sound that haunted Richard's dreams, the auditory reminder of every way he'd failed the only person who truly mattered. "He's difficult," Richard said, his jaw tightening with familiar defeat, his hands already retreating to his pockets in the unconscious gesture of a man who'd forgotten how to reach out. "Most people can't handle the intensity. The psychiatrist says he has abandonment issues stemming from—" But Maya was already moving, following the sound with the instincts of someone who understood that a crying child wasn't a problem to be solved, but a soul crying out for connection. Her heels clicked purposefully across the marble floors as she navigated the labyrinth of Richard's emotional fortress, past rooms filled with priceless art that had never brought anyone joy, toward the source of pain that money couldn't fix. She found Ethan in the playroom, a space that resembled a high-end toy store more than a place where children actually played. He was surrounded by educational gadgets worth more than most people's cars, robotic pets that responded to voice commands, and building sets designed by child psychologists to promote cognitive development. But none of these expensive solutions could address what he actually needed, someone to simply see him, hear him, understand that his pain was real and worthy of attention. The 4-year-old was sobbing with the kind of abandon that only comes from a heart too young to understand. "Why the world feels so devastatingly empty," his small body racked with the force of emotions too big for his developing mind to process. Maya approached slowly, reading his body language like a master translator, deciphering an ancient text. She didn't rush toward him with aggressive comfort or overwhelming sympathy. Instead, she simply made herself available, her presence steady and calm as a lighthouse cutting through a hurricane. "That sounds like a very big feeling," she said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of respect usually reserved for adult conversations. "It seems like something really important is happening inside your heart right now. Would you like to tell me about it?" Ethan looked up through tear-soaked lashes, his eyes, so heartbreakingly similar to his father's, wide with surprise at finding someone willing to listen rather than fix, to understand rather than dismiss. In the doorway, Richard watched something he hadn't witnessed in 2 years, his son's crying beginning to slow, not from exhaustion or defeat, but from the recognition that he'd been heard. "Daddy doesn't play with me," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. "He's always busy with important things. Mrs. Chen says I have to be patient because Daddy works very hard to take care of us, but—" His voice broke again. "But I just want him to want to be with me." The simple honesty of the statement hit Richard like a physical blow. This wasn't a tantrum or manipulation. This was pure truth delivered with the devastating clarity that only children possess. His son wasn't angry about toys or privileges or the material abundance that surrounded him. He was grieving the absence of the one thing money couldn't buy: his father's attention, presence, love. Maya nodded seriously, as if this was the most important information she'd ever received, as if the innermost thoughts of a 4-year-old carried the weight of international treaties and corporate mergers. "That must feel very lonely," she said, and her voice carried undertones of personal understanding that suggested she knew something about longing for love from people who seemed unable or unwilling to give it. "It does." Ethan wiped his nose with the back of his hand, his breathing starting to steady. "Sometimes I pretend that Mommy is still here, and she tells me that Daddy really does love me, but he just forgot how to show it, because he's too sad." The words hung in the air like suspended glass, beautiful and heartbreaking and sharp enough to draw blood. Richard's knees nearly buckled under the weight of his son's wisdom, this innocent child who'd constructed elaborate fantasies to explain away his father's emotional absence. "Are you here to take care of me too, like Mrs. Chen?" Ethan asked, hope creeping into his voice like sunrise after the longest night. "Well," Maya said, settling cross-legged on the expensive Persian rug that had never been sat on by anyone. "Under the age of 18, I was thinking maybe we could take care of each other. Sometimes the best families are the ones where everyone looks out for everyone else. Would you like that?" For the first time in months, Ethan smiled. Not the polite, practiced expression he'd learned to wear for his father's business associates, not the careful mask he put on for doctors and therapists, and well-meaning adults who asked how he was coping with his loss. This was a real smile, authentic and unguarded, reaching his eyes and lighting up the room like the first genuine happiness the penthouse had seen since Sarah's death. Richard gripped the doorframe so tightly his knuckles went white, feeling something crack inside his chest, not breaking but opening, like the first thaw after an endless winter, like ice that had protected him from drowning finally beginning to melt and allow him to breathe again. The universe has a way of bringing together exactly the right people at exactly the moment when they're brave enough to change everything they thought they knew about themselves. The next morning brought the first tremor in the carefully constructed earthquake that was Richard Morrison's life. He descended from his private elevator at precisely 6:30 a.m., following a routine so rigid it had become religious ritual, only to discover that his sterile kingdom had been quietly revolutionized overnight. The kitchen, a monument to stainless steel perfection that had served primarily as a coffee station for the past 2 years, had been transformed into something that looked almost like home. The marble countertops, previously pristine and untouched, now bore the evidence of actual cooking. Flour dusted across surfaces like fairy dust, mixing bowls stacked with the casual confidence of someone who knew her way around a real kitchen, and the scent of vanilla hanging in the air like a childhood memory made manifest. Maya stood at the professional-grade stove that had been installed more for show than function, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail that somehow made her look both completely at ease and utterly beautiful. She was humming, actually humming, as she flipped pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, with the kind of attention to detail that suggested she understood that for a 4-year-old, breakfast wasn't just nutrition, but possibility, creativity, love. Made edible. Ethan sat at the breakfast bar, still in his Spider-Man pajamas. Richard couldn't remember the last time he'd seen his son anything other than fully dressed by dawn, chattering with the enthusiasm of someone who discovered that mornings could be magical instead of merely mandatory. And then the T-Rex said to the Triceratops, "I'm sorry I was being mean, I was just really hungry." And they became best friends and shared a big pizza. Ethan was saying, his hands gesturing wildly as he narrated an elaborate story that seemed to be unfolding in real time. "That's a wonderful story," Maya replied, her voice carrying genuine interest rather than the patronizing tone adults often used with children. "What kind of pizza do you think dinosaurs would like best?" "Definitely pepperoni," Ethan said with the confidence of someone who'd given this matter serious consideration, "but maybe also leaves for the plant-eating ones." "Good morning, Mr. Morrison," Maya said without turning around, somehow sensing his presence in that mysterious way people develop when they're truly paying attention to their environment. "I made extra if you'd like some." The casual domesticity of the offer hit Richard like a challenge. For the past 2 years, breakfast had been a protein bar consumed in his private elevator or a cup of coffee grabbed from his assistant's desk. The idea of sitting down, of lingering, of participating in the simple ritual of family breakfast seemed both impossibly foreign and desperately appealing. "I don't usually eat breakfast," Richard replied automatically, the same words he'd spoken every morning to Mrs. Chen for months, a deflection that had become armor against the uncomfortable intimacy of shared meals. "I know," Maya said, placing a plate in front of Ethan that made the little boy gasp with delight. Dinosaur pancakes arranged to look like a prehistoric landscape, complete with bacon palm trees and scrambled egg clouds. "But Ethan does. Hand children learn more from what we do than what we say. There was no accusation in her voice, no judgment or criticism, just a simple truth delivered with the same gentle firmness she might use to remind someone that plants need water and engines need oil. But the implication hung in the air between them. Your son is watching you, learning from your choices, deciding what matters based on what you prioritize. Richard found himself pulling out a chair, something he couldn't remember doing in his own kitchen since Sarah's death. The bar stool felt foreign beneath him, like furniture from someone else's life. But as he settled onto it, something shifted in the room's energy. Ethan's chatter became more animated, directed toward his father for the first time in months. "Daddy, what's your favorite dinosaur?" Ethan asked, syrup decorating his chin like war paint from a very sweet battle. I don't know," Richard admitted, realizing with a start that he'd never given the matter any thought. In his world, favorites were luxuries, inefficient emotional attachments that served no strategic purpose. "Mine's the brontosaurus," Ethan said, biting into his dinosaur pancake with relish. "Maya says they were gentle giants who used their long necks to reach the best leaves. That's kind of like Daddy, isn't it, Maya? Really tall and reaching for important things." The innocent observation hit Richard like a revelation. In his son's eyes, his corporate success wasn't cold ambition. It was something admirable, something that made him comparable to gentle giants who used their advantages to reach beautiful things that others couldn't access. "What else did Maya tell you?" Richard asked, hearing his own voice soften in a way he'd forgotten was possible. "She said that families are like puzzle pieces," Ethan continued, his 4-year-old wisdom flowing freely in the safety of this breakfast sanctuary. "Sometimes they don't fit together right away because they're all different shapes, but when they finally figure out how to connect, they make something beautiful that's bigger than any of the pieces by themselves." Richard glanced at Maya, who was quietly washing dishes with the efficiency of someone who understood that the real magic happened not in grand gestures, but in the steady accumulation of small, caring acts. She was giving father and son space to reconnect without making it feel like a performance or therapy session. The pancakes were perfect, fluffy and sweet, with just a hint of vanilla and something else he couldn't identify, but that tasted like childhood should taste, if childhood was something you could capture and serve on a plate. Maya also said that sometimes daddies need practice learning how to play again, Ethan added, his tone becoming more tentative, as if he was testing whether this topic was safe territory. She said that when people are really sad for a long time, they sometimes forget how to do happy things, but they can remember if someone helps them. The psychological accuracy of the statement, delivered with such innocent hope, made Richard's chest tighten with emotions he'd spent 2 years suppressing. His son wasn't just processing his own abandonment, he was trying to understand and forgive his father's emotional absence, creating narratives that preserved his love for both parents while acknowledging the reality of their situation. 15 minutes. Richard had sat at his own table for 15 minutes, eating breakfast with his son, participating in the simple domestic ritual that millions of families took for granted. And the world hadn't ended. His phone hadn't exploded with urgent messages requiring his immediate attention. The stock market hadn't collapsed from his brief absence from the cosmic center of his own importance. But as he looked at his watch, 7:15 a.m., 15 minutes behind his usual schedule, old habits pulled at him like gravity, like addiction, like the familiar weight of responsibilities that had become indistinguishable from his identity. "I have a meeting," he said, standing abruptly, his body responding to ingrained patterns, even as his heart wanted to stay in this warm bubble of connection. Ethan's face fell with a speed that made Richard's chest physically ache, hope extinguished as quickly as a candle in a hurricane. "But we were talking about dinosaurs and families and—" "Mr. Morrison," Maya said quietly, not looking up from the dishes but somehow commanding the room's attention, "Ethan has something he wanted to show you. Something he worked on yesterday. Afternoon while you were in your conference calls. It'll only take a minute." Richard hesitated, car keys already in his hand, briefcase waiting by the door like a faithful dog, eager for their daily walk to the empire he'd built. In the corporate world, being late was weakness, inefficiency, a crack in the armor of professional perfection. But looking at his son's hopeful face, hope rebuilding itself with the resilience that only children possess, he realized that leaving might be something much worse than weakness. It might be the moment his son stopped hoping entirely. 1 minute, he said, and the words felt like jumping off a cliff. But some gifts are worth more than punctuality, and some moments change everything that comes after. Ethan scrambled down from his chair with the urgent enthusiasm of someone who'd been waiting for this moment, for what felt like forever, his small feet pattering across the marble floors as he ran to retrieve something from the living room. Richard stood frozen between two worlds, the familiar gravitational pull of corporate responsibility and this new, terrifying territory of fatherhood that Maya had somehow made accessible again. When Ethan returned, he was clutching a piece of construction paper that looked like it had absorbed every ounce of his 4-year-old concentration and love. The drawing was elaborate by preschooler standards, clearly the result of hours of careful work, with details that spoke to both artistic ambition and deep emotional investment. "This is for you, Daddy," Ethan said, holding up his masterpiece. With the pride of an artist unveiling a commissioned portrait. "I made it yesterday while you were on your important phone calls." Richard accepted the drawing with hands that trembled slightly, feeling the weight of something far more valuable than any contract he'd ever signed. The crayon figures were unmistakably intentional, a tall man in a blue suit standing next to a smaller figure with bright clothes and long hair, both of them holding the hands of a tiny person in the middle. Above them, a yellow sun smiled down with the benevolent approval that only children's artwork could convey, and "My Family" was written across the top, in careful 4-year-old letters that had clearly taken significant effort to form. But it was the details that broke Richard's heart open like a fault line, discovering its breaking point. Ethan had drawn the tall figure, clearly meant to be his father, not in the stiff, distant pose of a corporate portrait, but with arms outstretched, reaching toward the child in the middle. The expression, rendered in simple crayon strokes, was unmistakably happy. This was how his son saw him, or perhaps how his son hoped he could be. Present, engaged, loving. "This is you," Ethan explained, pointing to the tall figure with the reverence of a museum guide describing a masterpiece. "And this is me in the middle because Maya says families are circles and everyone protects the middle. And this..." He pointed to the third figure with an expression of such pure love that Richard felt his chest constrict. "This is Maya. She's part of our family now, isn't she, Daddy?" The question hung in the air like a bridge between what was and what could be. In his son's world, family wasn't defined by legal documents or blood relations or the complex social constructs that adults used to categorize relationships. Family was simply about who showed up, who stayed, who made breakfast in the morning and read stories at night and held you when you cried. Maya had been with them for exactly 1 day, but in Ethan's emotional landscape, she'd already earned a place in the sacred inner circle of people who mattered. Not because she was paid to be there, not because she was fulfilling a job description, but because she'd seen his pain and responded with love. "It's beautiful," Richard said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. This wasn't polite parental encouragement. This was recognition of a work of art that captured something true and precious about the possibility of healing, about the hope that broken families could be rebuilt into something even stronger than what they'd been before. Can I take it to my office?" Richard asked, the question emerging from some deep part of himself that he'd thought had died with Sarah. Ethan's smile could have powered the entire city. "Really? You want to put it where all the important business people can see it? Really? I want everyone to know that I have the most talented son in the world." The words came out naturally, without calculation or strategy, and Richard realized with a start that he meant them completely. When had he stopped being proud of Ethan? When had his love become so tangled up with grief that he'd forgotten how to celebrate his son's existence instead of mourning what they'd both lost? As Richard carefully folded the drawing and placed it in his briefcase, treating it with the reverence usually reserved for multi-million-dollar contracts, he felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what constituted important documents. This picture would travel with him to the 42nd floor of Morrison Technologies, where it would remind him throughout the day that somewhere in the city, a little boy was waiting for him to come home, not as a CEO or a corporate titan, but as a daddy who thought dinosaur pancakes were worth being late for. Maya watched this exchange with quiet satisfaction, recognizing the significance of a moment that might seem small to outside observers, but represented seismic emotional progress for this broken family. She understood that healing happened not in grand therapeutic breakthroughs, but in tiny daily choices to show up, to try, to risk caring again. "Maya," Richard said, turning toward her with an expression that was part gratitude, part confusion, and part something deeper that he wasn't quite ready to name. "Thank you for seeing what I couldn't see." "I didn't do anything special," Maya replied, though her eyes held the warmth of someone who understood that sometimes the most powerful intervention was simply bearing witness to love that already existed but had gotten lost in grief. "I just reminded Ethan that his daddy loves him. He's known it all along. He just needed someone to help him remember that love comes in different languages." As Richard drove to work that morning, the drawing carefully placed on his passenger seat like a co-pilot, guiding him toward a new destination, he couldn't shake the feeling that everything had changed. For the first time in 2 years, he'd prioritized a moment with his son over a schedule dictated by corporate efficiency. And instead of the world falling apart, something had been built. A bridge between the man he'd become and the father he'd always meant to be. The expensive leather interior of his BMW seemed almost silly now, luxurious but empty compared to the richness of a breakfast table where dinosaur pancakes were served with love and children's artwork was treated as treasure, more valuable than any acquisition his company had ever made. Some gifts arrive wrapped in innocence and colored, in crayon, but they carry the power to rebuild entire worlds if we're brave enough to let them. The Morrison Technologies building had never felt more like a stage set than it did that morning. Richard rode the elevator to his corner office, watching floor numbers climb as his mind replayed the breakfast scene that had just unfolded. Ethan's laughter, Maya's gentle wisdom, the feeling of being part of something larger and more meaningful than quarterly profit reports. In his office, Richard did something unprecedented. He cleared a space of honor on his mahogany desk, moving aside industry awards and expensive corporate gifts to make room for a crayon drawing that cost nothing and meant everything. His assistant, Margaret Stevens, knocked and entered with his usual morning briefing, stopping short when she saw the child's artwork displayed like a sacred artifact. "Mr. Morrison?" she asked, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned to navigate her boss's emotional unpredictability. "Is that new office decor?" "It's a gift from my son," Richard replied, and something in his tone warned against further comment. But Margaret had worked for him for 8 years, through the loss of his wife and the gradual transformation of a grieving man into an emotional fortress. She recognized significance when she saw it. "It's lovely," she said simply, and meant it. The day proceeded with unusual efficiency, as if Richard's small act of prioritizing family had somehow enhanced rather than compromised his professional effectiveness. He found himself making decisions with clearer focus, approaching problems with renewed energy, engaging with his team with a warmth that had been absent for months. But it was during the 2 p.m. board meeting, a routine quarterly review that usually left him feeling drained and disconnected, that Richard experienced something that would later mark the beginning of the end of his old life. Board member Harrison Wells was presenting market analysis data, droning through statistics about competitive positioning and revenue projections, when Richard's phone buzzed discreetly in his pocket. Maya's name appeared on the screen, followed by a text message that made his heart skip several beats. "Ethan asks if you can come home early today. He has a surprise for you. Nothing urgent, just he's excited to show you something." The simple message hit Richard like a revelation. When was the last time someone had wanted him home, not because of an emergency or obligation, but because his presence would bring joy? When had his arrival become something to anticipate rather than endure? Richard found himself staring at the message, while Harrison continued his presentation, half listening to projections about market penetration, while his mind wandered to a 4-year-old boy who was excited about something, excited enough to want to share it with his father. "Richard," Harrison's voice cut through his distraction, "your thoughts on the Southeast Asian expansion timeline?" "I'm sorry," Richard said, straightening in his chair and forcing his attention back to the room full of expensive suits and profit-driven ambition. "Could you repeat the question?" But even as he engaged with the corporate theater that had once consumed his entire identity, part of his mind remained fixed on that text message. Ethan had a surprise him. Ethan wanted to share something with him. Ethan was thinking about him in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, not because he needed something, but because he wanted to give something. The meeting concluded at 4:15 p.m., earlier than usual thanks to Richard's uncharacteristic efficiency and focus. As his colleagues filed out, discussing dinner plans and evening networking events, Richard made a decision that would have been unthinkable even a week earlier. He cancelled his remaining appointments. "Margaret," he called to his assistant, "reschedule the Hartman Industries call for tomorrow morning. And the budget review with accounting, clear my calendar after 4:30. Margaret's eyebrows rose to her hairline. "Sir, you have the Johnson Pharmaceutical presentation at 6. They've been trying to get this meeting for 3 months, sir." "Reschedule it," Richard said, already reaching for his briefcase and the precious cargo of Ethan's drawing. "I have something more important to attend to." The drive home felt different than any commute Richard could remember, not the usual escape from one set of responsibilities to another, but a journey toward something that felt suspiciously like anticipation. He found himself wondering what Ethan's surprise might be, imagining his son's face when he walked through the door hours earlier than expected. The penthouse was filled with an unusual energy when Richard stepped off the private elevator. The sound of laughter echoed from the kitchen, accompanied by what sounded like music. Not the classical arrangements that usually provided ambient sophistication, but something livelier, more playful. He followed the sounds to discover Maya and Ethan engaged in what appeared to be a cooking lesson of epic proportions. The kitchen looked like a flour bomb had detonated. White powder dusted every surface. Mixing bowls were stacked in creative arrangements, and both chef and student were decorated with evidence of their culinary adventure. "Daddy!" Ethan's voice carried pure joy as he spotted his father in the doorway. "You're home. Maya said you might come home early, but I didn't believe it, but you did, and we're making your favorite." "My favorite?" Richard asked, genuinely puzzled. He couldn't remember having expressed food preferences in Ethan's presence. "Chocolate chip cookies," Ethan announced with the excitement of someone revealing state secrets. "Maya asked me what you liked best, and I remembered that time when Mommy was sick and you brought her cookies from that fancy place, and you ate 3 of them and smiled and said they were perfect." The memory hit Richard like a physical blow. Sarah, 6 months pregnant and battling morning sickness, curled up on their old couch, while he tried desperately to find foods that wouldn't make her nauseous. He'd driven across the city to find the cookies she'd mentioned craving, and when she'd been too sick to eat them, he'd nibbled on them sadly, thinking about the family traditions they'd never get to build. Ethan had been 2 years old then, barely verbal, but somehow he'd absorbed and retained that moment of his father's simple pleasure. For 2 years that memory had lived in his small heart, waiting for the right moment to offer it back as a gift. "We made them from scratch," Maya added, her voice warm with understanding of the moment's significance. "Ethan insisted on doing everything himself. He's quite the baker." Richard looked at his son, covered in flour, beaming with pride, holding up a cookie sheet like a trophy, and felt the last of his emotional armor cracking open. This was the surprise Ethan had been excited to share. Not just cookies, but the gift of remembered love. The offering of a memory that proved their family had once been whole and could be whole again. "They smell incredible," Richard said, his voice rough with emotions he'd forgotten how to express. "They're still too hot to eat," Ethan said, bouncing on his toes with anticipation. "But Maya says we can have milk ready, and when they cool down, we can sit at the table like a real family and eat them together." Like a real family. The phrase echoed in Richard's mind as he looked around the chaos of his once pristine kitchen, now transformed into evidence of life being lived, love being expressed, memories being made in real time. As the afternoon progressed, something extraordinary happened. Richard found himself not just present but engaged, not just observing but participating. He helped Maya clean the kitchen while Ethan narrated the elaborate process they'd followed to achieve cookie perfection. He listened to his son's detailed explanation of why chocolate chips were superior to raisins. "Raisins are just sad grapes, Daddy, but chocolate chips are happy no matter what." When the cookies were finally cool enough to eat, they gathered around the kitchen table that had become the unlikely center of their family universe. Richard watched Maya and Ethan interact with the easy familiarity of people who'd learned to see each other clearly, completely, and with absolute acceptance. "Tell Daddy about the butterfly garden we're planning," Maya encouraged, and Ethan launched into an animated description of a project that would transform part of the penthouse terrace into a haven for monarchs and swallowtails. "Butterflies need special flowers," Ethan explained with the seriousness of someone discussing international trade agreements. "Maya says if we plant the right ones, they'll come visit us every summer. And maybe they'll bring their babies, too." Richard found himself asking questions, offering suggestions, becoming genuinely invested in a conversation about pollinator-friendly plants and migration patterns. When had he last felt this engaged with anything that didn't involve profit margins or market share? As evening approached, and they reluctantly acknowledged that bedtime was inevitable, Richard realized something that made his chest tight with a mixture of joy and fear. He didn't want this day to end. For the first time in years, he wanted to slow down time instead of racing toward the next achievement, the next deal, the next milestone that would supposedly bring satisfaction, but never did. "Daddy," Ethan said as they prepared for the bedtime routine, "can you stay for stories tonight? Maya reads them really good, but I want to hear what your voice sounds like when you're not talking about work." The innocent request hit Richard like a revelation about how his son perceived him, as someone whose natural voice had been lost beneath years of corporate speak and professional distance. The idea that Ethan wanted to hear who his father really was beneath the suit and the title and the carefully constructed executive persona felt both terrifying and incredibly precious. "I'd love to," Richard said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. That night, as he sat on Ethan's bed reading stories about brave knights and wise princesses, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death: the profound satisfaction of being exactly where he belonged, doing exactly what mattered most, with exactly the people who made his life worth living. Maya sat quietly in the corner, ostensibly organizing Ethan's bookshelf, but actually bearing witness to a father rediscovering his son and a son rediscovering his father. The room was filled with the gentle magic that happens when people choose presence over productivity, connection over conquest. As Ethan drifted toward sleep, his small hand still clutching Richard's finger, Richard understood that something fundamental had shifted in his understanding of success. This moment, his son's peaceful breathing, Maya's gentle smile, the feeling of being completely present in his own life, this was what winning actually looked like. But even as he savored this perfect evening, a nagging worry tugged at the edges of his consciousness. Tomorrow would bring boardrooms and bottom lines, expectations and obligations. How long could he maintain this delicate balance between the corporate world that had defined him and the family world that was redefining him? How long before someone noticed that Richard Morrison, master of the universe, was learning to care more about bedtime stories than board meetings? How long before his two worlds collided in ways that would force him to choose between everything he'd built and everyone he'd learned to love? Paradise, as Richard was about to discover, was more fragile than penthouse glass and far more precious than any empire, which made what happened next all the more devastating. 2 weeks had passed since Maya's arrival, and the Morrison penthouse had undergone a transformation so profound that Richard sometimes felt like he was living in someone else's life, someone who deserved happiness, someone who remembered how to be human instead of merely successful. The changes were everywhere. Ethan's laughter echoing through rooms that had been silent for too long, the scent of home-cooked meals replacing the sterile emptiness of takeout containers, the gentle sounds of family life breathing warmth into spaces that had become mausoleums of grief. Maya had brought more than childcare. She'd brought the possibility of healing, the radical idea that their broken family could be rebuilt into something even stronger than what they'd lost. But paradise, Richard was about to learn, was a fragile construction, vulnerable to the very forces that made it precious. The call came on a Thursday morning that had started like a scene from a different universe, one where Richard Morrison was a father first and a CEO second. He'd taken the revolutionary step of working from home for the morning, conducting video conferences from his study, while Maya and Ethan built elaborate Lego cities in the living room nearby. The sound of their collaboration, Ethan's excited planning, Maya's encouraging responses, provided a soundtrack of domestic contentment that made even the most tedious business calls bearable. Richard was reviewing quarterly projections when his personal phone rang with the specific tone he'd assigned to James Whitfield, his oldest friend, his business confidant, and increasingly his conscience in matters where corporate success conflicted with human decency. "Richard, we have a problem." James's voice carried the kind of urgency usually reserved for natural disasters, stock market crashes, or the death of someone important. A big one. Margaret Chen called an emergency board meeting for this afternoon. Something about concerns. Regarding your recent behavioral changes, the words hit Richard like ice water in his veins. Behavioral changes. They're calling it erratic decision-making patterns and concerning shifts in priorities that may compromise fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. James paused, and Richard could hear the weight of information he didn't want to deliver. "Richard, someone's been watching you, taking notes, building a case." Through the glass doors of his study, Richard could see Maya patiently helping Ethan arrange tiny Lego people into family groups, her gentle voice explaining how different families could be built in different ways, but all families needed love to hold them together. The innocence of the scene felt suddenly fragile, threatened by forces that had nothing to do with the simple human connections they'd been building. "What kind of case?" Richard asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "They have documentation of every meeting you've left early, every call you've declined, every time you've put personal matters ahead of corporate priorities. They know about Maya, her background, her employment history, the fact that she's young and attractive and living in your home." James's voice dropped to a whisper. "Richard, they're not just questioning your judgment, they're questioning your fitness to lead a publicly traded company." The accusation hit Richard like a slap, not because it was untrue, but because it represented everything he'd been trying to escape. For 2 years, he'd been the perfect corporate machine, emotionless, tireless, completely devoted to the pursuit of profit and market dominance. He'd sacrificed his relationship with his son, his own mental health, his capacity for joy, all in service of an organization that now viewed his rediscovered humanity as a liability. "There's more," James continued, his reluctance to share, the information evident in every word. "They've hired a private investigation firm, background checks on Maya, surveillance reports on your household routines, even interviews with former Morrison Technologies employees about your declining engagement with corporate culture." Richard felt the room spinning around him, the comfortable sanctuary of his home office suddenly feeling like a trap closing in on everything he'd started to rebuild. "They're investigating Maya. They want to know if there's anything inappropriate happening, any reason to question your judgment about bringing an unvetted individual into your private life. They're looking for ammunition, Richard, anything they can use to justify removing you from leadership." The implications crashed over Richard like a tsunami of corporate cruelty. Maya, who'd done nothing but love his son and teach him how to be a father again, was being treated like a potential threat, her privacy invaded, her motives questioned, her very presence in their lives transformed into evidence of his professional incompetence. "Who's leading this?" Richard asked, though he suspected he already knew. "Harrison Wells is spearheading the investigation, but Margaret's the one calling the shots. She's convinced that you're having some kind of breakdown, that your judgment has been compromised by grief and other factors. James paused significantly. Richard, you need to understand what you're up against. These people built their careers on eliminating threats to corporate stability. They see your newfound interest in work-life balance as a disease that could spread to other executives, compromise the culture of total dedication that they believe built Morrison Technologies. Through the glass, Richard watched Maya help Ethan create a Lego playground, their heads bent together in concentration as they constructed something beautiful and unnecessary and completely wonderful. This was what they saw as a threat, a woman who reminded him that there's more to life than profit margins. What do they want? And Richard asked, though the answer was already forming in his mind like a storm cloud on the horizon. They want you to make a choice, Richard. The company or your domestic situation, your career or whatever this is that you've built with Maya and Ethan. James's voice carried the weight of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. They want you to prove that Morrison Technologies comes first, that your recent behavior was a temporary aberration, that you can return to being the dedicated corporate leader they need. And if I refuse, then they'll find a way to remove you. Shareholder confidence, fiduciary irresponsibility, failure to maintain appropriate professional standards, they'll manufacture whatever justification they need. Richard closed his eyes, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed new life closing in around him. Everything he'd started to rebuild, his relationship with Ethan, his growing feelings for Maya, his rediscovered sense of what actually mattered, was now under attack by the very empire he'd spent 15 years building. The emergency meeting is at 3 p.m., James continued. They'll want an answer, Richard. A public commitment to corporate priorities over personal entanglements. They want you to fire Maya and return to the executive lifestyle that made Morrison Technologies successful. The word fire hit Richard like a physical blow. Fire Maya, the woman who'd given him back his son, who'd taught him that love wasn't weakness but the greatest strength imaginable, who'd shown him what home could feel like when built on presence instead of profit. I need time to think, Richard said, though thinking felt impossible when his entire world was being pulled apart by forces beyond his control. You have until 3 p.m., James replied. Choose carefully, Richard. Some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. As Richard ended the call, he sat in his study surrounded by the monuments to his professional success. Awards, recognition, framed articles proclaiming him a visionary leader, and realized that none of it mattered compared to the sound of his son's laughter drifting through the walls, but losing it all would mean more than personal sacrifice. Morrison Technologies employed 12,000 people, funded medical research that saved lives, pushed the boundaries of technology that helped families like his own survive the worst moments of their lives. How could he choose his personal happiness over the greater good that his company represented? How could he choose anything else? When everything you've built threatens to destroy everything you've discovered, the only choice is to decide which version of yourself you're willing to fight for. By noon, Richard's carefully constructed new world was crumbling with the systematic efficiency of a controlled demolition. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. Board members calling to express concern, major investors requesting clarification on leadership stability, and business journalists who'd somehow gotten wind of internal corporate drama and smelled blood in the water. Margaret Stevens knocked on his study door with an expression that suggested she was delivering condolences rather than his afternoon schedule. Mr. Morrison, there are developments you need to know about. She entered carrying a manila folder thick enough to represent someone's life story, which Richard realized with growing dread was exactly what it was. The private investigation firm had been thorough, more thorough than any corporate background check had a right to be. They've compiled a complete dossier on Miss Thompson, Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral, though her disapproval was evident in every syllable. Her employment history, financial records, personal relationships, educational background, even interviews with former colleagues and romantic partners. The violation of Maya's privacy hit Richard like a physical assault. This woman who'd asked for nothing but the chance to care for his son was being dissected by corporate investigators, as if she were a potential terrorist, rather than someone who made dinosaur pancakes and taught children that families could be built from love. Instead of obligation, what did they find? Richard asked, though he already knew the answer would be irrelevant. When powerful people wanted to destroy someone, evidence was merely a formality. Margaret opened the folder with the reluctance of someone handling contaminated material. Nothing criminal, nothing even particularly concerning from an objective standpoint, but they've constructed a narrative. She began reading from the report with the detached tone of a coroner delivering autopsy results. Subject demonstrates pattern of emotional attachment to employer families, particularly single fathers with young children. Previous employment terminated following inappropriate boundary violations with employer. Though investigation reveals this was actually resignation due to employer's inappropriate advances that she rejected. Richard's hands clenched into fists. They were taking Maya's strength, her refusal to tolerate harassment, her commitment to professional ethics, and twisting it into evidence of instability. There's more, Margaret continued, clearly uncomfortable with her role as messenger. They've documented every interaction between you and Miss Thompson over the past 2 weeks. Breakfast conversations, evening activities, the time you came, home early from the Johnson meeting to help with cookie baking. The last phrase carried such ridiculous gravity that under other circumstances, Richard might have laughed. But there was nothing amusing about watching his tentative steps toward healing being catalogued as evidence of mental breakdown. They're characterizing your behavior as emotional dependency on domestic staff and suggesting that your judgment has been compromised by inappropriate feelings for an employee. Margaret's voice dropped to an embarrassed whisper. They have photographs, Richard, professional surveillance photographs of you, Maya, and Ethan together, at the park, in your kitchen, building that blanket fort in your living room. The image of strangers lurking outside his home, photographing his son, turning moments of family joy into ammunition for corporate warfare, made Richard feel physically sick. These people had weaponized love itself, transformed the most precious memories of his recent life into evidence of professional incompetence. They're calling it rebound relationship syndrome. Margaret continued, her embarrassment evident. The report suggests that you're using Miss Thompson as a Sarah substitute, that your feelings are grief-driven rather than genuine, and that your judgment regarding both her and Morrison Technologies has been compromised by unresolved trauma. Richard stared at the folder, realizing that somewhere inside those pages was a psychological profile written by strangers who'd never met him, never seen him with Ethan, never witnessed the gentle way Maya had taught him to be present for his son. They'd reduced the most meaningful relationship he'd built since Sarah's death to a clinical diagnosis, a pathology to be treated rather than a miracle to be celebrated. What's their recommendation? He asked, though he suspected he already knew. Immediate termination of Miss Thompson's employment, mandatory executive counseling to address grief-related decision-making impairment, and a return to the focused leadership style that built Morrison Technologies' success. Margaret paused, choosing her next words carefully. They want you to publicly recommit to corporate priorities, Richard. They want a press conference announcing your renewed dedication to the company, with no distractions from personal entanglements. The language was clinical, professional, completely reasonable sounding. But underneath the corporate speak, Richard heard the real message. Abandon the woman who'd taught you to love again. Return to the emotional isolation that made you a perfect executive. Choose profit over humanity because that's what leadership requires. There's one more thing, Margaret added, her voice carrying a note of genuine concern that cut through her professional neutrality. They've also prepared talking points for explaining Miss Thompson's departure. If you agree to their terms, the story will be that you've decided to pursue more traditional childcare arrangements, better suited to Ethan's needs as he grows older. And if I refuse, Margaret's expression answered before her words did, then they'll release their findings to selected business journalists and major shareholders. The story will be about a grieving CEO whose judgment was compromised by an inappropriate relationship with domestic staff, leading to declined performance and questionable decision-making that threatens shareholder value. Richard realized, with crystal clarity, that he was facing a no-win scenario designed by people who'd confused ruthlessness with leadership, who saw human connection as weakness rather than the source of all meaningful strength. They would destroy Maya's reputation, question his mental health, and turn their beautiful, fragile family into tabloid entertainment, all to preserve a corporate culture that valued machines over human beings. The sound of laughter from the living room drew his attention back to what actually mattered. Maya and Ethan were now engaged in what appeared to be a tickle fight, both of them giggling with the kind of uninhibited joy that reminded Richard why any of this was worth fighting for. "When do they need an answer?" he asked. "The emergency. Board meeting starts in 2 hours," Margaret replied. "They'll expect your decision then." 2 hours to choose between everything he'd built and everything that made building worthwhile. 2 hours to decide whether love was worth losing an empire for. 2 hours to discover what kind of man he really was when everything else was stripped away. In the crucible of impossible choices, we discover not just what we're willing to sacrifice, but what we're absolutely unwilling to live without. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m. in the Morrison Technologies Executive Conference Room, the same space where Richard had built his empire through 15 years of strategic brilliance, hostile negotiations, and the kind of corporate warfare that separated winners from casualties. Now, as he stood outside the polished mahogany doors at 2:58 p.m., he realized he was about to fight the most important battle of his life against the very institution he'd created. The conference room had been designed to intimidate 40 feet of polished granite tables surrounded by leather chairs that cost more than most people's annual salaries, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city below, and artwork that whispered of wealth and power and the kind of success that came to those willing to sacrifice everything else for it. But today, the familiar trappings of corporate authority felt like props in a theater production about people who'd forgotten what it meant to be human. Richard entered at exactly 3 p.m., carrying nothing but a manila folder containing his decision and the quiet confidence that comes from finally knowing exactly who you are and what you stand for. The board members were already assembled, 12 of the most powerful people in the medical technology industry, their faces arranged in expressions of professional concern that barely masked their predatory anticipation. Margaret Chen sat at the head of the table, her silver hair styled with the precision of someone who'd never allowed chaos into any aspect of her life, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable. But Richard knew her well enough to recognize the signs of disappointment and determination that marked someone preparing to perform surgery on a relationship she'd once valued. To her right sat Harrison Wells, the board member who'd built his fortune on hostile takeovers and corporate restructuring, a man who viewed human emotions as market inefficiencies to be eliminated through strategic intervention. His smile carried the cold satisfaction of a predator who'd cornered his prey. "Richard," Margaret said with a slight nod, her voice carrying the formal neutrality of a judge about to deliver a verdict. "Please sit down. We have a great deal to discuss." Richard remained standing, understanding instinctively that this moment required him to claim physical space, to resist the subtle power dynamics that would position him as a defendant rather than an equal participant in the conversation. "Actually, Margaret, I think this will be relatively brief," he said, his voice carrying a calm certainty that seemed to surprise several board members who'd expected defensiveness or corporate groveling. He opened his folder and placed a single sheet of paper on the polished granite surface, his letter of resignation, typed that morning in the quiet clarity that comes after you've stopped running from the most important decision of your life. The silence that followed was so complete that the hum of the building's ventilation system seemed deafening. Margaret's composed mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something that might have been shock, disappointment, or perhaps even a flicker of respect for someone willing to choose principle over profit. "Richard," she said carefully, her voice regaining its professional control, "I think you may be acting in haste. Perhaps we should discuss alternatives before you make a decision you might regret." "There are no alternatives," Richard replied, his voice carrying the kind of calm certainty that couldn't be argued with or negotiated away. Not for me. Not anymore. Not when the choice is between being the father my son deserves and being the kind of executive you think you need. Harrison Wells leaned forward with the predatory smile of someone who'd built his career on finding leverage in other people's vulnerabilities. Mr. Morrison, I think you're forgetting that you don't just walk away from a company worth $3 billion because of personal feelings. You have responsibilities. To shareholders, to employees, to the medical research we fund, to the families whose lives depend on the technology we develop. The argument was perfectly crafted, designed to appeal to Richard's sense of duty and social responsibility. For 15 years, those same words had motivated him through 16-hour days, justified personal sacrifices, and provided moral cover for choosing corporate success over human connection. But today they rang hollow. You're absolutely right, Richard agreed, moving to the window and looking out at the city where millions of people were living their lives, making their own choices between security and happiness, duty and love. I don't walk away because of personal feelings. I walk away because I finally remembered what all of this was supposed to be for. He turned back to face the board, seeing their faces clearly for perhaps the first time. Expressions ranging from confusion to calculation to barely concealed contempt for someone who'd apparently chosen weakness over strength. 14 years. Ergo, I started this company because I wanted to save lives. I wanted to make medical technology that would prevent other families from going through what Sarah and I experienced when we lost our first pregnancy. I wanted to build something that mattered, something that made the world better for children like Ethan. Then why? Margaret began, but Richard continued, his voice growing stronger and more certain with each word. Because along the way, I forgot that the point of saving lives is to make those lives worth living. I became so focused on the mission that I lost sight of the reason for the mission. I was building technology to strengthen families while my own family fell apart. I was working to save other people's children while I was failing my own. Son? The words carried a weight that seemed to shift the room's energy, forcing the board members to confront the human cost of the corporate culture they'd created and defended. This isn't about grief anymore, Richard continued, his voice growing more passionate as he finally found words for everything he'd been feeling. This is about choice. You've presented me with what you think is an impossible decision. Choose between loving my son and leading this company. But that's only impossible if you believe that love makes people weak instead of strong, that caring about family compromises professional judgment instead of enhancing it. He pulled out his phone and showed them the photo from the previous evening, himself, Maya, and Ethan covered in cookie dough and flour, all three of them laughing, with the kind of uninhibited joy that most adults forgot was possible. This is what success looks like to me now. Not market share or quarterly profits or industry awards. This moment when my son looks at me like I'm his hero instead of a stranger who pays for his clothes. This feeling of coming home to people who actually want me there. Not because of what I can provide, but because of who I am when I'm brave enough to be fully present. Margaret stood slowly, her hands pressed flat against the table, her expression a complex mixture of professional disappointment and personal understanding. And the company, the 12,000 employees, the shareholders who trusted you with their investments, the medical research that depends on our continued success. The question struck at the heart of Richard's internal conflict, the genuine tension between personal happiness and social responsibility that had kept him awake for the past 2 weeks. The company will not only survive, it will thrive, Richard said with quiet confidence that seemed to surprise even himself. You'll find new leadership, probably better leadership than I've been able to provide. Someone who can give Morrison Technologies the single-minded focus it deserves. Someone who won't get distracted by 4-year-olds who need help building blanket forts, or women who remind them that there's more to life than profit margins. He moved toward the door, then paused and turned back one final time, needing to say words that had been building in his chest for weeks. I'm not abandoning Morrison Technologies. I'm setting it free to become something even better than what we built together. And I'm setting myself free to become the man my son deserves to have as a father. The man my wife would have wanted me to be. The man I was before I decided that love was a luxury I couldn't afford. Harrison Wells made one last attempt to regain control of the narrative. You're making a mistake, Morrison. You think you can just walk away from responsibility and play house with the hired help. You'll regret this when the novelty wears off and you realize what you've thrown away. Richard smiled, not the polished corporate smile he'd perfected over years of negotiations, but something real and warm and completely unguarded. Harrison, the only thing I regret is that it took me 2 years to realize that the most important board meeting of my life happens every morning at my breakfast table. The most crucial negotiations involve a 4-year-old who wants to know if dinosaurs like chocolate chip cookies. The most valuable acquisitions can't be measured in dollars. They're measured in moments when someone you love looks at you and sees exactly who you've always had the potential to become. As Richard walked out of the boardroom, leaving behind 15 years of his life and $3 billion in corporate value, he felt something he hadn't experienced in so long he'd almost forgotten what it was called: freedom. The kind of freedom that comes not from having infinite options, but from finally knowing exactly what matters most, and having the courage to choose it, regardless of the cost. Freedom is terrifying until you realize it's the only thing that allows you to build something true from the ashes of everything you thought you needed. The elevator doors closed behind Richard with a soft whisper, sealing him away from the corporate world he'd inhabited for 15 years, like a man stepping out of a tomb into sunlight. As he descended from the 42nd floor of Morrison Technologies for the last time as CEO, Richard felt something he hadn't experienced since the day Ethan was born: the terrifying, exhilarating sensation of free fall. His phone buzzed incessantly. Text. Messages from board members expressing everything from shock to admiration to barely concealed satisfaction. Voicemails from business journalists who'd gotten wind of the story and smelled blood in the water. Missed calls from major shareholders demanding explanations for the sudden leadership vacuum at one of the medical technology industry's most stable companies. Richard turned off the phone and drove home through city streets that looked different in the afternoon light. Not because anything had changed about the buildings or the traffic or the way the sun hit the windows of the skyscrapers, but because he was seeing them through eyes that were no longer clouded by the weight of impossible expectations and corporate obligations. He'd spent 15 years climbing a mountain that he'd realized, somewhere around the summit, was the wrong mountain entirely. When Richard walked into his penthouse, he found Maya in the kitchen, packing the last of her belongings into a worn duffel bag with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago not to get too attached to places, or people, or the feeling of being wanted. Her movements carried the resigned grace of someone who'd always known that good things were temporary, that love was something that happened to other people, that families like the one they'd been building were too precious to last. "You don't have to do that," Richard said quietly, setting down his briefcase and loosening the tie that had felt like a noose around his neck all afternoon. Maya looked up, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, but her posture still strong, still determined, to do what she thought was right, even if it broke her heart into pieces small enough to fit in that battered duffel bag. "Richard, I won't be the reason you lose everything you've worked for," she said, her voice carrying the steel of someone who'd survived worse losses than this and knew she could survive this one too, even if she wasn't sure she wanted to. "What if I told you that losing everything I thought I worked for was the best thing that ever happened to me?" Richard replied, stepping closer to this woman who'd given him back his son, his heart, his understanding of what actually constituted a life worth living. Maya's hand stilled on the zipper of her bag, hope and disbelief warring in her expression like sunrise fighting through storm clouds. "What did you do?" "I resigned," Richard said simply, the words feeling both monumental and incredibly natural in his mouth. "Effective immediately. No severance package, no golden parachute, no negotiated transition period. I walked away from Morrison Technologies, like a man walking away from a burning building that he finally realized was on fire." The duffel bag slipped from Maya's hands, hitting the marble floor with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the sudden silence of the kitchen. "You what?" I quit my job, Maya. I chose you. I chose Ethan. I chose us. Richard's voice grew stronger with each word, as if speaking the truth out loud was giving him power he hadn't known he possessed. I chose the possibility of building something real instead of maintaining something that was slowly killing everything I actually cared about. Maya shook her head, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he was telling her, her mind struggling to process the idea that someone would sacrifice an empire for love. But your company, your legacy, everything you built over 15 years. I built a company, Maya, Richard interrupted gently, stepping close enough to take her hands in his, feeling the tremor of disbelief and hope that ran through her, like an electric current. But you helped me build a family. Which do you think will matter more to Ethan when he's my age? Which do you think I'll remember on my deathbed? The quarterly reports I obsessed over, or the morning we made dinosaur pancakes together, and he told me his dreams. Maya's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady with the strength of someone who'd learned to question good fortune because experience had taught her that it was usually too good to be true. Richard, you can't just throw away your entire career for love. Richard finished, cupping her face in his hands and seeing himself reflected in her eyes. Not the polished corporate version of himself, but something rawer and more real and infinitely more valuable. For the chance to wake up every morning with people who actually want me around. For the possibility of teaching my son that there are things more important than money and status and the approval of people who will never really know you. He paused, gathering courage for words that felt like jumping off a cliff into unknown territory. Maya, 3 weeks ago, I was the most successful failure you'd ever met. I had everything I thought I wanted, and nothing that actually mattered. I was living in a museum of my own achievements, surrounded by expensive things that meant nothing, ruling over an empire that felt more like a prison with every passing day. Richard moved to the kitchen window, looking out at the city skyline. That had once represented his kingdom, but now looked like just another collection of buildings where people were trying to figure out how to be happy. And then you walked into our lives, he continued, his voice soft with wonder, and reminded me that love isn't a luxury or a distraction or something you do when all the important work is finished. Love is the important work. Love is the only work that actually matters when everything else is stripped away. The sound of small footsteps on marble stairs announced Ethan's arrival before they saw him, still in his afternoon pajamas after his nap, rubbing sleep from his eyes and carrying his stuffed elephant with the casual confidence of someone who'd never doubted that his favorite things would always be there when he needed them. "Daddy," Ethan said, looking confused by the early evening intensity he'd walked into, the sight of Maya's packed bag, the emotional weight that seemed to fill the kitchen like humidity before a storm. "Why is Maya crying, and are you going away again?" The innocent question hit Richard like a revelation about what his son had learned to expect from life, that people left, that love was temporary, that happiness was something that happened in brief intervals between longer periods of loss and disappointment. Richard knelt down to his son's level, pulling the little boy into his arms and feeling the solid weight of everything that truly mattered, everything he'd almost lost in pursuit of things that had never mattered at all. "I'm not going anywhere, buddy," Richard said, his voice thick, with emotions he was finally allowing himself to feel. "Ever again. I'm done going away, and I'm done choosing work over you. I'm done pretending that anything in the whole world is more important than being your daddy." "Really?" Ethan asked, his 4-year-old heart cautiously rebuilding hope that had been disappointed too many times before. "You're not going to have more important meetings." "The only important meetings I want to have are with you," Richard replied, meaning every word with an intensity that surprised him. "I want to have meetings about whether we should have pancakes or waffles for breakfast. I want to negotiate the terms of bedtime stories and discuss the strategic importance of building the perfect blanket fort." Ethan's face lit up like the 4th of July, but then his expression grew serious as he looked at Maya's packed bag. "But what about Maya? Is she still going away?" Richard looked up at this woman who'd taught him that courage looked like choosing love even when the whole world told you it was impractical, even when powerful people tried to convince you that caring was weakness rather than the greatest strength imaginable. "That depends on Maya," Richard said, his voice carrying 15 years of heartbreak and 3 weeks of healing. "I have a question I need to ask her." And then, right there in the kitchen where they'd shared their first breakfast, as an accidental family, where they'd learned that home wasn't a place but a feeling that happened when the right people decided to show up for each other, Richard Morrison got down on one knee. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a ring he'd bought during his lunch break, not the massive diamond that corporate success would have dictated, but a simple band with 3 small stones representing the family they could choose to become together. "Maya Thompson," he said, his voice steady despite the enormity of the moment, despite the fact that he was proposing marriage while his entire professional life crumbled around him, despite the reality that he was asking someone to build a future with a man who'd just given up everything that society said made him valuable. "Will you marry me? Will you help me figure out how to be the kind of man Ethan can be proud of? Will you let me spend the rest of my life trying to deserve the love you've shown us? Will you take a chance on building something beautiful?" With a former CEO who just remembered that the most important title he'll ever hold is Daddy, Maya looked down at this man who'd given up everything he thought he wanted for everything he actually needed, who'd walked away from a $3 billion empire because he'd finally understood that empires were worthless if they were built on the graves of the relationships that gave life meaning. She thought about the investigation folder, the corporate threats, the systematic attempt to destroy her reputation and his career. She thought about the courage it had taken for him to choose love over fear, family over profit, presence over power. She thought about the little boy watching them with wide eyes, waiting to see if the adults in his life would finally choose each other, choose him, choose the radical possibility that families could be built from hope instead of obligation. "Yes," Maya whispered, and then louder, her voice ringing with the certainty of someone who'd finally found home in the most unexpected place. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll help you figure out how to be human instead of just successful. Yes, I'll take the chance, because sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most beautiful outcomes." Ethan cheered and threw himself into the group hug that followed. And for the first time in 2 years, Richard's penthouse was filled with the sound of pure joy echoing off marble walls that had forgotten what happiness sounded like. Outside, the sun was setting over a city full of people chasing dreams they thought would make them happy, building careers they hoped would give their lives meaning, accumulating wealth they believed would protect them from the fundamental human need for connection and love. But inside this kitchen, 3 people had discovered something more valuable than any fortune. They'd found each other, and in finding each other, they'd found themselves. Love, it turns out, is the only investment that grows stronger when you give it away, and the only empire worth building is the one where everyone has a home. 6 months later, the house was a radical departure from the penthouse, smaller, warmer, nestled into a tree-lined neighborhood in Westchester, where children rode bicycles on sidewalks that actually got used, where neighbors knew each other's names and borrowed cups of sugar without irony, where the American dream lived in modest proportions that prioritized connection over conquest. Richard stood at the kitchen window of their new home, watching Maya teach Ethan how to plant tomato, seeds in the garden they'd started that spring. The backyard was a revolution in itself. Actual grass instead of marble terraces, flower beds that attracted butterflies instead of interior designers, a swing set that Richard had assembled himself, cursing creatively at the instructions while Ethan offered 4-year-old engineering advice. This kitchen was real in a way the penthouse kitchen never had been. It had a breakfast nook that caught the morning sun, cabinets that showed honest wear from daily use, and countertops that bore the honorable scars of family life. Flour stains from weekend baking projects, crayon marks from homework sessions, water rings from countless cups of coffee shared while making plans for an ordinary, extraordinary life. The past 6 months had been an adventure in redefining success on terms that actually mattered. Richard had started a small consulting firm called Balanced Leadership Solutions, helping medical technology companies remember that innovation served people, not profit margins. He made a fraction of what he'd earned at Morrison Technologies, But he made enough. More importantly, he made a difference in ways that let him sleep peacefully at night instead of lying awake calculating market projections. His first client had been an unexpected one, Morrison Technologies itself, now, under the leadership of Dr. Sarah Kim, the brilliant researcher who'd been Richard's head of development. Margaret Chen had approached him through James Whitfield, asking if he'd be willing to consult on humanizing corporate culture while maintaining competitive edge. The irony wasn't lost on anyone involved. "You were right," Margaret had told him during their first meeting in his modest new office. "We needed someone who remembered that the point of building medical technology was to save lives, not just generate revenue. Sarah's doing excellent work, but she wanted the perspective of someone who'd learned to balance ambition with humanity." Maya had returned to teaching, but in a different setting. A progressive school in nearby Scarsdale that valued creativity and emotional intelligence alongside academic achievement. She came home every day with stories about breakthroughs and discoveries, about children who were learning that their feelings mattered as much as their test scores, about the small miracles that happened when adults remembered that education. It was about nurturing souls, not just transmitting information. Mrs. Morrison, her students called her now, and the title carried a warmth that Miss Thompson had never possessed. Not because marriage changed her essence, but because she was finally in a place where her full self was welcomed, where her gifts were recognized, where she could build the kind of classroom community she'd always dreamed of creating. Ethan was thriving in ways that report cards couldn't measure, and psychological evaluations could only hint at. He was confident without being entitled, curious without being demanding, secure in the knowledge that his parents would be there when he needed them, not someday when work permitted, but right now, in this moment, for whatever mattered to a 5-year-old heart navigating the complex world of kindergarten friendships and playground politics. He'd started calling Maya Mom without any formal discussion or transition period. It happened naturally, the way all the best family transitions. To one morning at breakfast, he'd asked, "Mom, can you help me with my backpack?" And Maya had simply said, "Of course, sweetheart," and that was that. Love had been formalized by usage rather than law, though the legal adoption papers were already in progress. The doorbell rang, interrupting Richard's quiet contemplation of the family scene unfolding in their garden. He opened it to find James Whitfield, holding a bottle of champagne, and wearing the kind of grin that suggested excellent news worth celebrating. "Morrison Technologies stock hit an all-time high today," James announced, stepping into the house. That felt more like home than the penthouse ever had, despite costing a tenth as much and having a fraction of the square footage. Dr. Kim's leadership is being hailed as visionary. The board is happy. The shareholders are ecstatic. Even Margaret Chen admits you made the right choice for everyone involved. "And how is Margaret?" Richard asked, genuinely curious, about the woman who'd been both mentor and adversary in his journey toward understanding what really mattered. "Retiring next month," James said, accepting the beer Richard offered and settling into the comfortable chaos of a kitchen where life was actually lived. "She told me to tell you that she's finally figured out what you knew all along, that life is too short to spend it all in boardrooms discussing metrics that won't matter to anyone in 50 years. Maya and Ethan came in from the garden, both of them covered in soil and sunshine, both of them glowing with the satisfaction of work that would yield actual tomatoes instead of abstract profits. Their hands were dirty from honest labor. Their clothes bore the evidence of an afternoon spent nurturing something that would grow and provide sustenance. Their faces carried the contentment that comes from time spent together without agenda or productivity goals. Uncle James," Ethan launched himself at his honorary uncle, who caught him despite the dirt that would definitely stain his expensive suit. The ease with which James accepted the collision of garden soil and Italian wool spoke to how much he'd learned about priorities from watching his friend's transformation. "Hey there, kiddo. How's the garden growing? We planted tomatoes and carrots and flowers that Mom says will attract butterflies," Ethan said, his words tumbling over each other with the excitement of someone who'd discovered that creating life was more thrilling than consuming entertainment. "And Daddy helped, but he's not very good at it yet." "I'm learning," Richard said. accepting the gentle teasing with the grace of a man who'd discovered that being imperfect at something you loved was infinitely more satisfying than being perfect at something that left you empty. The afternoon unfolded with the comfortable rhythm of people who'd learned to prioritize presence over productivity. James stayed for dinner, Maya's famous lasagna made from scratch with tomatoes from their own garden, mixed with store-bought ingredients, because perfection was less important than participation. Over dinner, James shared updates from the corporate world that had once consumed Richard's entire identity. Harrison Wells was forced to resign last month. Insider trading scandal. Turns out his aggressive acquisition strategies involved some ethically questionable information gathering. Richard felt no satisfaction at his former adversary's downfall, only a mild sadness for someone who'd never learned that shortcuts to success usually led to longer-term failures of character. The new board is implementing what they're calling Morrison's Principles, James continued. Work-life balance initiatives, mental health support for executives, even a company-wide policy that no employee, regardless of level, is expected to respond to work communications outside of established business hours. Maya smiled at Richard across the table, understanding the beautiful irony that his departure had catalyzed exactly the kind of corporate culture change he'd never been able to implement from the inside. They're naming the new family support program after Sarah, James added quietly. The Sarah Morrison Family First Initiative. It provides paid leave for employees dealing with family medical emergencies, childcare support for single parents, and mental health resources for people struggling with loss. Richard felt his eyes well up with tears he didn't try to hide. His wife's name would live on not in marble monuments or corporate buildings, but in policies that would help other families navigate the kind of crises that had nearly destroyed his own. She would have loved that, he said simply. After James left and Ethan had been tucked into bed with stories about brave knights and wise princesses who built gardens instead of conquering kingdoms, Richard and Maya sat on their back porch, watching stars appear in a sky that seemed impossibly vast compared to the narrow slice of heaven visible from their old penthouse. The night air carried the scent of their garden, the distant sound of neighbors calling their children in for baths, the gentle symphony of a community settling into evening routines that prioritized connection over conquest. "Any regrets?" Maya asked, her head resting on Richard's shoulder, her hand tracing lazy patterns on his chest, where his heartbeat had finally learned to maintain a rhythm that wasn't dictated by stock market fluctuations or board meeting schedules. Richard considered the question seriously, thinking about the life he'd left behind, the power that had isolated him, the prestige that had felt more like imprisonment, the sense of being essential to something larger than himself that had ultimately made him feel smaller than he'd ever imagined possible. "Just one," he said finally. Maya lifted her head to look at him, concern flickering in her eyes like candlelight in a gentle breeze. "I regret that it took me so long to figure out that the most important board meeting of my life happened. Every morning at our breakfast table," Richard said, his voice soft with wonder at how much his understanding of success had evolved. "I regret all the mornings I missed before I learned that the best investment I could make was in the people who would remember me long after the stock market forgot my name." Maya smiled and settled back against his chest, her contentment radiating through her body like warmth from a fireplace. "For a former CEO, you're getting pretty good at this happiness thing." "I had excellent teachers," Richard replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head and thinking about the little boy sleeping peacefully down the hall, dreaming dreams that included a daddy who stayed for story time and a mom who taught him that families were like gardens. They grew best when tended with patience, watered with love, and given room to become something beautiful together. As one chapter closes, another begins, not with fanfare or corporate announcements, but with the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the most important work happens in moments too small for headlines, but too meaningful for anything else to matter. 1 year later, the cherry blossoms were in full bloom along the tree-lined street, where the Morrison family had built their new life, petals drifting across sidewalks like nature's confetti celebrating the arrival of spring. Richard stood at the kitchen window, coffee in hand, watching a scene that had become as essential to his morning routine as breathing. Maya and Ethan in their garden, now expanded to include a small greenhouse and raised beds that produced enough vegetables to share with neighbors, but today was different. Today, Maya's movements were more careful, her hand occasionally resting on the gentle curve of her belly where new life was growing. A miracle they'd discovered just 8 weeks ago, when Ethan had asked with the innocent curiosity of a 5-year-old why Mommy was so tired lately. "Daddy," Ethan had said, his eyes wide with wonder when they'd told him the news, "does this mean I'm going to be a big brother?" "It means," Richard had replied, kneeling to his son's level, "that our family is growing, just like our garden. Just like love, the more you share it, the more you have." Now, watching his pregnant wife teach his son how to identify which tomatoes were ready for harvest, Richard felt a contentment so profound it made his chest ache with gratitude. This was what wholeness felt like. This was what it meant to be rich in ways that had nothing to do with bank accounts or stock portfolios. The phone rang, interrupting his peaceful contemplation. The caller ID showed Margaret Chen's name, and for a moment, Richard felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that corporate calls had once triggered. But Margaret was no longer his board chairwoman. She was simply someone who'd become an unexpected friend after they'd both learned that life was too short for grudges and too precious for anything but authenticity. "Good morning, Margaret," Richard said, settling into the breakfast nook where so many important conversations had taken place over the past year. "Richard, I hope I'm not calling too early." Margaret's voice carried a warmth that their corporate relationship had never allowed. "I wanted to be the first to tell you. The Sarah Morrison Family First Initiative won the National Corporate Responsibility Award last night. The program has helped over 3,000 families in the past year." Richard felt tears sting his eyes. Sarah's legacy wasn't just living on, it was thriving, growing, touching lives she'd never met, but somehow continued to bless through the ripple effects of love and policy and corporate culture that finally prioritized people over profit. "She would be so proud," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "We all would be," Margaret replied. "The board voted unanimously to establish a permanent endowment in her name. We're funding family support programs at medical technology companies nationwide. Your resignation didn't just change Morrison Technologies, Richard. It started a movement." After they hung up, Richard sat in the quiet kitchen, marveling at how choices made in love could create consequences far beyond what the heart could imagine when it was brave enough to choose what mattered most. Maya and Ethan came inside, their hands dirty from honest work, their faces glowing with the satisfaction that comes from nurturing life in all its forms. Ethan was chattering excitedly about the butterfly he'd seen, a monarch that had landed on Maya's shoulder as if blessing the moment with its presence. "Daddy, Mum says butterflies are like angels," Ethan said, washing his hands at the kitchen, sync with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that even simple tasks could be performed with love. "They start as caterpillars, but then they change into something beautiful that can fly." Richard looked at his wife, understanding the metaphor she'd offered their son, a story about transformation, about how the most beautiful things often emerged from the most unlikely circumstances, about how change wasn't something to fear, but something to embrace when it led you toward who you were always meant to become. "That's right," Richard said, pulling both of them into a hug that encompassed everything he'd learned about what it meant to be truly successful. "Sometimes we have to let go of who we used to be to become who we're supposed to be." The rest of the morning unfolded with the comfortable rhythm they'd perfected over months of choosing presence over productivity. Breakfast was an unhurried affair. Whole grain pancakes made from scratch, fresh strawberries from their garden, orange juice that Ethan had learned to squeeze himself. No phones at the table, no urgent emails demanding immediate attention, no corporate emergencies that couldn't wait for family time to conclude naturally. After breakfast, they walked to Ethan's school together, a daily ritual that Richard treasured not because it was particularly momentous, but because it was ordinary in the most extraordinary way. Other parents nodded and smiled, some stopping to chat about weekend plans or neighborhood events, And Richard marveled at how much joy could be found in these simple interactions with people who knew him not as a former CEO, but as Ethan's dad. Maya's husband, the guy who always volunteered to help with the school garden project. In the quiet moments between one ordinary day and the next, we discover that the most profound transformations happen not in boardrooms or headlines, but in the accumulated grace of choosing love over and over again. That evening, the house was filled with the gentle sounds of family life winding down toward bedtime, water running in the upstairs bathroom where Maya was helping Ethan with his bath, the distant hum of the dishwasher cleaning up after another day of shared meals, the settling sounds of a home that was truly lived in rather than simply occupied. Richard sat in what had become his favorite chair, a comfortable recliner that had cost less than one of his old business suits, but provided infinitely more satisfaction. In his lap lay a book he'd been reading to Ethan before bath time. The Giving Tree, a story about love and sacrifice, and the difference between giving everything away and sharing everything you have. On the side table beside him sat 3 photographs that told the story of his transformation more clearly than any corporate biography ever could. The first showed him in his Morrison Technologies office, surrounded by awards and accolades, his expression professionally composed but emotionally vacant. The second captured the moment Maya had first walked into their lives, Ethan in her arms, both of them flower-covered and laughing while Richard stood in the background, still in his business suit but with something awakening in his eyes. The third was from their wedding day 6 months ago, a small ceremony in their backyard with only their closest friends and neighbors, all 3 of them glowing with the kind of happiness that couldn't be purchased or negotiated, only chosen, and nurtured and protected with daily acts of love. "Daddy," Ethan's voice called from the top of the stairs, followed by the sound of bare feet pattering down hardwood floors. He appeared in his favorite pajamas, ones decorated with dinosaurs building houses instead of fighting battles, a detail that Maya had noticed and Richard had learned to appreciate as a metaphor for the life they were creating together. "Yes, Birdie, Mom says the baby is going to be born when the leaves change colors. Will you still have time to read stories to me when the baby comes?" The question carried the innocent anxiety of a child who'd learned that love was precious and sometimes fragile, that families could change in ways that felt scary even when they were ultimately beautiful. Richard set down his book and opened, his arms welcoming Ethan onto his lap with the automatic gesture of someone who'd finally learned that availability was more important than achievement, presence more valuable than productivity. "Ethan," Richard said, his voice carrying the gentle certainty of someone who'd learned to make promises he intended to keep, "do you remember when you used to worry that Daddy might go away because work was more important than you?" Ethan nodded, his 5-year-old memory clear on this particular fear that had shaped too many of his early years. "Well, I learned something very important," Richard continued, smoothing his son's hair with the tenderness of someone who'd discovered that love was an action rather than just a feeling. "There will always be room for you in Daddy's arms, in Daddy's time, in Daddy's heart. When the baby comes, we'll have more love, not less. Love isn't like money. It doesn't get smaller when you share it. It gets bigger." Maya appeared in the doorway, her hand resting on the gentle curve where their second child was growing, her expression soft with the contentment of someone who'd found home in the most unexpected place and with the most unlikely people. "Are you boys having important conversations without me?" she asked, settling onto the arm of Richard's chair and completing the family circle that had become the center of everything that mattered. "Daddy was explaining about love being bigger when you share it," Ethan said, snuggling deeper into the warmth of their impromptu family huddle. "That's very wise," Maya said, catching Richard's eye over their son's head and sharing one of those wordless communications that couples develop when they've learned to see each other clearly, completely, and with absolute acceptance. "Will you tell me the story about how our family started?" Ethan asked, a request that had become part of their bedtime routine, though the telling never got old because each version revealed new details, new understanding, new appreciation for the miracle of 3 broken people finding each other and discovering they fit together perfectly. "Once upon a time," Richard began, his voice taking on the gentle cadence of someone who'd learned that the best stories weren't about conquering kingdoms, but about building homes. There was a daddy who had forgotten how to be happy. He lived in a tall tower and spent all his time working, thinking that if he just worked hard enough, he could fix everything that felt broken in his heart. But he couldn't, Ethan added, knowing this part by heart but still needing to hear it confirmed. No, he couldn't. Because the thing that was broken wasn't something that could be fixed with work or money or any of the things he thought were important. What was broken was his connection to the people he loved most. Maya took up the story, her voice weaving seamlessly into the narrative they'd created together. And then, one day, a teacher who had lost her job, but never lost her ability to see the magic in ordinary moments, came to take care of a little boy who just needed someone to listen to his big feelings. And the teacher taught the daddy how to make pancakes shaped like dinosaurs, Ethan continued, his contribution to the family mythology. But more importantly, Richard said, she taught the daddy how to sit still long enough to hear what his son's heart was trying to tell him. She showed him that love wasn't something you had to earn or achieve. It was something you had to choose every day, in big ways and small ways, until choosing love became as natural as breathing. And then they became a real family, Ethan concluded with satisfaction. We were always a real family, Maya corrected gently. We just had to learn how to see it, how to trust it, how to build it into something strong enough to hold all. Our love and all our dreams and all our hopes for tomorrow. As they sat together in the gathering twilight, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 18 months ago, he'd been a man who measured success in stock prices and quarterly reports, who lived in isolation despite being surrounded by people who'd convinced himself that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. Now he understood that love wasn't a luxury. It was the only necessity that actually mattered. Everything else, career success, financial security, social recognition, was just decoration around the edges of what made life worth living. The house settled around them with the contented sighs of a home that was truly inhabited by people who'd chosen each other not just once, but every day in countless small decisions to show up, to stay present, to prioritize connection over convenience. Outside, the neighborhood was settling into evening routines, families gathering around dinner tables and homework sessions and bedtime stories, the ordinary miracles that happen when people remember that the most important work of being human is learning how to love and be loved in return. I think it's time for bed, little man, Maya said as Ethan's eyelids began to flutter with sleepiness. Will you both tuck me in? He asked, the question carrying no anxiety now, just the confident expectation of someone who'd learned that. His parents' love was reliable, consistent, permanently available. Always, Richard said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. As they climbed the stairs together, Richard carrying Ethan, Maya moving slowly to accommodate the new life growing within her, Richard felt the profound satisfaction of someone who'd finally figured out what success actually looked like. It looked like a 5-year-old who fell asleep confident that he was loved. It looked like a woman who'd found a partner worthy of her strength and tenderness. It looked like a man who'd learned that the most important meetings happened at breakfast tables, the most crucial negotiations involved bedtime stories, and the most valuable acquisitions couldn't be measured in dollars, but in moments when someone you loved looked at you and saw exactly who you'd always had the potential to become. Later that night, as Richard and Maya lay in bed listening to the quiet sounds of their home, the hum of the refrigerator, the settling of floorboards, the distant sound of Ethan's peaceful breathing, Richard spoke into the darkness words that summarized everything. He'd learned about what it meant to be truly wealthy. Thank you, he said simply. For what? Maya asked, though her voice carried the warmth of someone who understood that gratitude was no longer an occasional gesture, but a way of being in the world. For seeing who I could be when I'd forgotten myself. For teaching me that courage looks like choosing love, even when it costs everything else. For showing me that the most successful life isn't the one where you have the most, but the one where you love the most and are loved the most in return. Maya turned toward him in the darkness, her hand finding his face with the gentle familiarity of someone who'd mapped every line and curve through countless moments of tenderness. "You know what I learned," she said softly. "I learned that home isn't a place you find. It's something you build, one choice at a time, one day at a time, with people who see your heart and decide it's worth staying for." As they drifted toward sleep, Richard's last conscious thought was of gratitude, not just for what he'd found, but for what he'd been brave enough to leave behind in order to find it. Tomorrow would bring new, ordinary miracles. Breakfast conversations about dinosaurs and butterflies, garden work that produced tomatoes and life lessons in equal measure, bedtime stories that transformed simple moments into sacred rituals. Tomorrow would bring another day of being rich in all the ways that actually mattered. And Richard Morrison, former CEO of a $3 billion empire, current husband and father and gardener of small dreams, fell asleep with a smile on his face and peace in his heart, knowing that he had finally learned the most important business lesson of all. The most successful life is one where success is measured not in what you accumulate, but in what you give away, not in what you achieve, but in who you become, not in what you build, but in who you love and who loves you back. As Frederick Douglass once said, "It's easier to build strong children than to repair broken men." Richard Morrison learned that the hard way, but he learned it in time to build something beautiful with his son, in time to choose love over legacy, in time to discover that the most successful life is one where success is measured not in dollars earned, but in hearts touched, moments shared, and love given freely. Sometimes the greatest victory is having the courage to surrender. Sometimes the most profitable decision is the one that costs you everything you thought you wanted and gives you everything you actually need. The rain that began this story was still falling somewhere, on other penthouses, in other lives where people were learning the difference between being successful and being fulfilled. But in a modest house in Westchester, where a small family had chosen each other against all odds, and in spite of all obstacles, the sun was always shining. "Daddy's home," Ethan had said in his sleep that first night after Richard's resignation, and those two words became the foundation of everything that followed. Not just Daddy's here, but Daddy's home. Present, available, committed to staying not just physically but emotionally, not just for the convenient moments, but for all the moments that make up a life worth living. Sometimes coming home means leaving everything else behind. Sometimes the most important journey is the one that leads you back to who you always meant to be. If you haven't already, please like this video right now. It only takes a second, but it makes a huge difference in helping others discover these life-changing stories. Subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our weekly stories of transformation, courage and hope. And comment below, what part of Richard's journey resonated most with you? What choice are you ready to make in your own life? I read every single comment, and your thoughts often inspire the stories I tell next. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for believing that stories like this still matter in a world that often forgets what really counts. Until next time, remember, the most important title you'll ever hold isn't on your business card. It's in the hearts of the people who call you family.